Hi, this is Jonathan Slater, host of Tête-à-tête, Conversations in Canadian Jewish Studies. Tête-à-tête is a production of the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies, Association d'Études, juives canadiennes. In my previous life as a director of a university Jewish studies program, each year we invited a speaker onto campus to talk on the theme of the Holocaust. On a couple of occasions, our guest was a survivor. The students were totally engrossed in what the survivors had to recount of their ordeal during the Shoah. However, both left behind for the students to read copies of their published memoirs of those ordeals. In my mind, the survivors' visits clearly helped students connect personally with people who had firsthand experienced the Holocaust. Yet, I believe their memoirs could have an emotional and social impact beyond the 60 minutes spent in the survivors' presence. Memoirs foster empathy. Students step into another person's lived history. A history, yes, but not an abstract recitation of people, places, and events. Perhaps a rich enough narrative that could motivate thoughtful social concern or even action. Maybe leading them to reflect on their own experiences, values, and choices. Perhaps fostering self-awareness and emotional resilience. For students and for us in general, published survivor memoirs can also provide access to voices that might otherwise have remained silent for all time. My guests today on the podcast know a lot about Holocaust memoirs. Sara Horowitz and Carson Phillips are two of the scholars, among 6 in total, who appear in conversation in the fall 2025 issue of Canadian Jewish Studies, Études, juives, canadiennes, as part of a forum. 20 years of publishing survivor narratives, scholars reflect on the educational and cultural impact of the Azrieli Foundation's Survivor Memoirs Program. Sara is an award-winning author and teaches humanities and comparative literature at York University. Carson is the memoir program's manager of academic initiatives and teaches at Yeshiva University and Gratz College. Sara, Carson, welcome to Tête-à-tête.
Thank you. Delighted to be with you.
Yeah, thank you.
So, Carson, let me start with you. How did you come to be involved in the Azrieli Foundation Survivor Memoirs Program?
Well, I'll give you the condensed version because the original point of entry goes back over 20 years ago when I was a graduate student of Sara's at York University.
Really?
Yeah. And I was assigned a research assistantship, and I didn't know anything really much about it because the program was new and getting started. And I was assigned to the Holocaust Survivor Memoirs Program, where my task was to assess manuscripts that had been submitted in terms of the content, the narrative, sort of developing abstracts, I guess, of what was contained within the life writing, the life story that Holocaust survivors had submitted. So I worked on a number throughout the research assistantship. I worked on a number of memoirs of doing the assessments. One of them, which came to fruition this year, Lament, by Moshe Kantorowicz. But that was really my first foray over 20 years ago, and Sara was my mentor at the time.
Wow, that's a fascinating story. Sara, I'd love to know more about your background and how it led to your participation in the memoirs program.
Oh, I'd be delighted to tell you that. But I do want to say, since Carson did mention that his first encounter with the memoirs was when he was a graduate student studying in my class on Holocaust literature, that Carson is one of the people who was once a student and is now a colleague and whom I number among my friends. And it's always really wonderful when that happens. My engagement with memoirs is part of my engagement with Holocaust writing. In my turn as a graduate student, wrote a dissertation on certain aspects of Holocaust literature. In particular, I was interested in muteness and silence, what it is that could not be said directly, but was communicated, let's say, in the white spaces, in the silences. I mostly engaged with fiction, but at a certain point, when I turned to life writing, memoirs and diaries, I was thunderstruck by how immediate it felt. In the case of diaries, it was as though somebody was talking to me directly from the time. And in the case of so many diaries, the people who wrote them didn't make it. Both manuscripts and published diaries, and they were voices from the dead. The memoirs were, by definition, not voices from the dead. They were voices of the living, and they were a bit different from diaries in that they knew how things ended. They knew how the Holocaust evolved and devolved, and the high price that was paid. But I was very much struck by the power of life writing at a time when historians didn't want to go near memoirs. But coming from literature, what interested me was the power of the individual voice describing what happened over the course of a lifetime. So, how did that bring me to the Azrieli memoirs? I was approached more than 20 years ago by Naomi, whom I also met, interestingly enough, as a student in a class that I was teaching. I
And we're
sometimes
talking about Naomi
Naomi
Azrieli.
Azrieli, yes.
Yeah.
Naomi had completed a dissertation in Russian history, and she went to this summer institute, this 2 week long institute. It's taught by several faculty members teaching out of different areas of expertise. And I was there as the person teaching literature. And I guess because most of the people there were American, we had some Europeans, but very few Canadians that year. Naomi and I started talking about Toronto. It turned out we didn't live very far from each other, and we struck up an acquaintance. I was struck by how smart she was, how bright she was, and how deeply she cared about the Holocaust, but not only as a historical phenomenon, how deeply she cared about the individual voices as came through in our literature seminar. And so a few years later, Naomi approached me and said that the foundation was interested in starting a project on publishing memoirs, and was I game? Would I work with her on it?
Wow. That's amazing. That's really amazing. I like your term life writing as to distinguish it from, as you had contrasted, historical accounts. I'm imagining that that's a term of craft that memoir publishers use, life writing. Where does that come from?
It really comes from literary theory about first person accounts, right? How do we think about first person accounts? How do we understand them? They're certainly not the same thing as historical narratives generated by historians, but they're also not the same thing as the kinds of narratives that come across in fiction, even fiction by people who had lived through some of the events that they weave into their fictional accounts. So it's a really broad category under which are encompassed somewhat different kinds of writing. Historians tend to call these things ego
Hmm.
documents. I find ego documents is really sort of a very technical, kind of documentary-ish way of describing it, and it seems to suggest how can we read them and use them, whereas life writing puts the focus on the lived life and the person who lived that life and who is recounting it and telling their story.
Fascinating. Thanks for that clarification. So, Sara and Carson, the memoirs, as I understand, are all formal published works, and the memoirs program is not a commercial effort. And I think it's fair to say that they are meaningful stories that otherwise might have been lost to us, that these are powerful accounts by ordinary, everyday people. Let's go to this clip from Naomi Azrieli, who's chair and CEO of the Azrieli Foundation.
Around or about 2004, my father decided to really build up the Azrieli Foundation. He understood instinctively there were probably survivors just like him who had struggled with telling their stories and weren't finding publishers.
So, my question to both of you is, how has the program come by these memoirs? What's been the route of these memoirs into publication? Talk a little bit about that.
So I can start us off, I guess. I would say that when the program initially started, word was passed through synagogues, through Jewish community groups, through Holocaust survivor groups and organizations, that this was a new project that was being initiated in Canada to collect and to publish the life stories, the memoirs, the diaries of Holocaust survivors who rebuilt their lives in Canada. So I think a lot of the initial publications, and certainly that's remained true over the years, have been manuscripts that have arrived because someone heard about the program through a friend, through a colleague, through a synagogue or a group that they were part of. And that word of mouth, I think, has been really important for getting manuscripts and getting documents ready for publication.
Publication process, from what I've learned, is pretty rigorous. Can you walk us through that process?
So I would agree with you that the process is a rigorous process and, can take anywhere from a matter of 8 or 10 months to over a year, depending upon the manuscript, depending upon the amount of fact checking that may be required or editing that may be required. So that's part of the process. And then, of course, if translation is required, translation itself can be a very lengthy process, which may involve multiple translators. As well as academic involvement to make sure the voice of the survivor is being maintained, even in a translated copy.
But I'm guessing that there are also memoirs that don't make it into print. What happens with those documents?
So it's an interesting question about what happens to documents and what happens to manuscripts that are submitted. We still have a number who are in the archives who are awaiting publication. Some may be published through an anthology. They may not be perhaps lengthy enough for a full memoir, but it may appear as a narrative that's part of an anthology, a collection of stories. And that has certainly happened. For my time at the foundation, there was a writing program to capture the life stories of Holocaust survivors who may not have had either the desire or perhaps the ability to create a full memoir, but perhaps they wanted to record their experiences primarily for their family, to have something on paper. And that was called the Sustaining Memories Program. And those memoirs live on our website. They are accessible through PDF format. And they would be shorter than a full publication memoir would actually be. I think that's probably the majority of our publications either have been full publications through Sustaining Memories and some awaiting publication still in the archives. And we still receive publications. Even this year, we've received several manuscripts.
Wow.
Yeah, let me add to what Carson said. Holocaust survivors who have written out memoirs are often looking to get them published. Some of them, before submitting them to the Azrieli Foundation's Memoirs Publication Program, have tried to have their memoirs published commercially and not been successful because, as anyone knows who's tried to publish a commercial book with a trade press, it's not so easy to get any book published.
True.
And somehow the publication of Holocaust-related books, particularly memoirs, has evolved such that either it has to be a famous person's memoir,
Right.
oh, you didn't know this about so-and-so, or something really unusual about the story. But the real strength of the cluster of memoirs, the collection of memoirs, if we think about them together, published by the Azrieli Foundation, is that, Jonathan, you used the word ordinary people. Insofar as all of us are ordinary, Holocaust survivors are ordinary people who have gone through extraordinary
Absolutely.
experiences.
Absolutely.
And that doesn't necessarily speak to the sense of the market, if we can call it that a trade press has. And so having this project, which is not seeking to make a profit, but seeking to publish and distribute and disseminate these works, have really allowed people who want their word out there to get out there, and also to give, let's call it a better sense maybe to a reading public of the Holocaust, because each of these stories is different, and yet layered together, they all tell a story of a particular set of places and moments in time, right? They build upon one another. And to read several of the memoirs is to really begin to build a knowledge of what it was like to live through those years.
So, Sara, let me ask you, is there one or more particular memoirs that resonate for you among the memoirs that you've read?
I want to say that all of them resonate with me when I read them. So I hate, let's say, playing favorites, but a few that I teach frequently and that I find myself writing about are Judy Cohen's memoir, A Cry in Unison. And, Judy Cohen's experiences are very powerful, but she also has been, I don't think it's a stretch to call her an activist, advocating for people to pay attention to women's experiences during the Holocaust. And since gender has been an interest of mine, having somebody like Judy Cohen, who is a survivor herself and thus can speak with that voice of authority, saying, no, it's really important to focus on that. She's been really important. And her memoir is just so powerful and so readable that my students really like it, and they love having her come as a visitor to Horace. I really liked that one. One of the first memoirs that I had a hand in editing was Henya Reinhardt's Bits and Pieces, and it really opens up the pre-war world of the changing and evolving Yiddish culture in Eastern Europe for Reinhardt's family, for her family of origin. The Bund was really important, and so I love teaching it because students really get a slice of life. I love Nate Leipziger's The Way to Freedom, and maybe because I've known all of those survivors, they speak to me in very powerful ways.
Carson, same question. Which memoirs in particular resonate for you?
It's a tough question, and I agree with Sara that, it's really difficult or maybe challenging to choose just a few because each of them, I think, has their own strengths, their own merits. And I think one thing I like so much about the collection, and Sara alluded to this, is that there's such a variety that you start to understand the Holocaust not only as this historical event, but you understand it through the lens of humanity, of human beings, of how human beings responded to what was happening around them. I think that's really the power that comes from memoir, and why perhaps we all choose different memoirs and sometimes overlapping memoirs. I like many of the memoirs, and I've taught in my own classes some of the memoirs that Sara mentions, like Bits and Pieces by Henya Reinhardt. I think is just a beautiful memoir to give students an understanding about Yiddish culture, Yiddish, life and heritage. And some of the ones that I guess have gravitated towards over the years have been In Dreams Together by Leslie Fazekas. I like it because it is a series in the beginning part, a series of letters and diary entries that he wrote to his then girlfriend, who later becomes his wife. They are both sent to Austria as forced laborers, but they don't know where one another is. It's just a beautiful story of a human relationship in the midst of the horror of the Holocaust that's taking place around them. I think another one that I use a lot is Pinchas Gutter, a survivor here in Toronto. Again, his detail is very rich. We understand how someone struggles to maintain their humanity during the Holocaust. And I think the one that I've been using most recently in some of my courses is a new publication, Lament by Moshe Kantorowicz. And one of the things I like so much about this memoir is that it's the only manuscript that we'd received from a survivor who rebuilt their life in Newfoundland. So it's a unique Canadian experience in that aspect. But his detail is just phenomenal. I often describe his memory as being like a camera of someone who just goes through scene by scene of event like a camera. It's an amazingly richly textured memoir.
Hi there, I'm Valentina Gaddi, French editor of the Canadian Jewish Studies journal, Revue d'Études juives canadiennes. You remember that our journal is bilingual, right? Well, Volume 42 is an entirely French issue dedicated to the translation of sociologist Robert Brim's landmark 2024 survey, Jews and Israel, Canadian Attitudes and Jewish Perceptions. This timely and influential study is now fully available in French, opening it to a wider community of researchers, students, policymakers, and anyone interested in contemporary Jewish life in Canada and in Quebec. Volume 42 showcases the association's growing commitment to expanding French language scholarship through both original contribution and translations. It reflects a broader effort to build a truly bilingual space for Canadian Jewish studies, one that will encourage dialogue, accessibility, and diverse form of knowledge. So be sure to check it out on our website, canadianjewishstudies.ca. It's free to access and a great way to brush up on your français. We can't wait for you to engage with this material.
So you've both been talking about how you use these memoirs in teaching. And my understanding is that the memoirs program is above all a pedagogical project, a way to engage young people, students, a new generation in significant recollections of the Holocaust. Before I go on with additional questions for you, Sara and Carson, let's listen to this excerpt by Jody Spiegel, program director of the memoirs program.
The Holocaust Survivor Memoirs Program has a dual mission. We are publishers and we are educators. As publishers, we produce memoirs written by Holocaust survivors who came to Canada after the war. And once these memoirs are out in the world, we work in every province and territory, training teachers to take these memoirs into the classroom and work with their students to make them part of the conversation.
Sara and Carson, in what ways does reading memoirs as part of the classroom experience facilitate that experience, facilitate the pedagogical objectives focused on the Holocaust?
I really have two answers to that question. One has to do with memoirs generally, and the other has to do really more specifically with teaching selections of this particular collection of memoirs to students in a Canadian university. So if I want to talk generally about the value of memoirs, there is something about entering into the inner life of a person who experienced something that helps students engage with history, engage with the past, understand the human consequences of racism, anti Semitism, genocide. It makes the students ask questions about how people get through these kinds of ordeals. It makes them understand how strongly the odds were against the survivors and what factors into surviving, but also even when one survives, what kinds of losses and trauma one carries with them. And those are really important things to think about. But if I want to get really specific, I have to talk a little bit about the kinds of students that I teach. So I teach at York University. I would say the demographics of the university pretty much mirrors the demographics of the population of the Greater Toronto Area. And that means that the students who take my class really reflect a very wide range of religious, ethnic, national, cultural backgrounds. And a large number of them are immigrants themselves or children of families who have immigrated, and not like 70 years ago, but maybe in the past decade or 15 years. So the memory of immigration and perhaps the memory, the familial memory, if not the personal memory of the students, of why they came to Canada, perhaps a set of circumstances that they really needed to leave or to flee, are very alive with them. And the memoirs, particularly because the memoirs focus on the life before it was interrupted by the rupture of the Holocaust, the cataclysmic nature of what people went through during the Holocaust, and then coming to Canada and struggling to rebuild a life here, very much touches students regardless of their background. So the experience of Holocaust survivors and the experience of the Holocaust is not something that falls into this mental category of historical things that happen to other people don't really have anything to do with me, but are things that resonate with them as, yes, these kinds of things happen to people, and it's really important to keep them in living memory.
And I would say, Sara, one of the points that you've made there, I think, which is so important, is that for students encountering the Holocaust, sometimes it's the visual impact of the Holocaust that can be overwhelming. And I'm an example of that as, a number of years ago, obviously, when I was in high school. But, the way I was introduced to the Holocaust was through very visceral images that were photographs and archival footage of the liberation of the camps, Bergen-Belsen in particular. And, that is sort of a shock and awe, I think, sort of approach to education, which is not how the Holocaust is taught today. But the way that I came back to Holocaust studies was through literature, and it was through the lens of literature that allowed me to be able to engage in a topic that is deeply sensitive and a topic that, you see the worst of humanity, but yet at the same time, you can also see the goodness of humanity. And it was that complexity for me that came through literature. And I think that's what makes literature, Holocaust survivor memoir, a unique way of studying the Holocaust. And it allows, I would say, a learner to have their own sort of safe space to imagine and to work with descriptions, to work with survivor testimony and passages in a way in which they can go as deeply as they may feel comfortable going to it. I would say the other aspect that gets to really the heart of literature, and again, Sara talked about this, is that, not every story, not every Holocaust survivor story has a natural resolution to it. It's going to leave us grappling with complexities. And I think that's also the power of literature, that not everything, gets wrapped up with a bow for an ending, that we are left sometimes sitting with traumatic events that survivors went through. Some will be very positive. They'll have, stories of reunion with family members post-liberation, but there's also stories of immense trauma that survivors went through. And we are part of that, I guess, that journey of going with the survivor, listening, hearing the survivor's voice as we're reading literature and memoirs, and then sitting with that afterwards and having to sort of make sense of that. And I think, as Sara mentioned, like, we all see that. Depending on what your background is, you may have a different entry point to it, but you'll still recognize the humanity, the inhumanity, the human suffering, the resiliency of the human spirit. Those are all something that we can relate to. And I think it's a really powerful part of Holocaust memoir and literature.
I'm really glad that you sort of mentioned that sense of the unresolved aspect, because sometimes people, they sort of create a binary. They think in their mind that there are survivors who are broken by the experience of trauma, and there are survivors who overcome it and they're resilient. And one of the things that I like to emphasize in my teaching, but that memoirs can so powerfully bring out, is that it's not either or. There is a part, there can very well be a part of a survivor that has managed to overcome, to build a life, to build a career, to lead a meaningful life. And at the same time, there is a part of that survivor that is just anchored in that traumatic past and isn't out of it, hasn't overcome it. They're both true at the same time. And you can talk theoretically about that paradox, but you read a memoir and you read it closely, and there it is sort of laid out for you.
So one of the motifs that stood out for me in the fall 2025 forum on the memoirs program that you were involved with your colleagues, and I think we should mention them: Doris Bergen at University of Toronto, Cheryl Fury at University of New Brunswick, Sherry Simon at Concordia University, and Zoe Waxman at University of Oxford. One of the motifs that stood out to me is the role of translation in the delivery of memoirs to the reading public. And we know that crossing languages can complicate the storytelling process, but I imagine it also opens it up in a way not possible, for example, if certain memoirs remain closeted away in the native tongues of the survivors. Could you talk about the translation process and what that takes away, what that adds to the publication of the memoir?
So I can start us off and say that I think the translation process is individual to each manuscript. So there's not really one sort of formula that's used for translation. It will depend upon the individual manuscript, how it was written, the voice of the survivor. Maintaining that uniqueness of the voice of the survivor is really one of the paramount rules that we follow for the translation process. And I can give you an example with Moshe Kantorovic's Lament. He actually wrote the manuscript himself in Yiddish, and he then translated it himself from Yiddish into English. And he didn't always know if the correct term he was using in English was the correct term. So there's that to consider. But there's also the point, I think, with a memoir like his, is that he referred to the names of Polish towns and villages by their Yiddish names. Now, they wouldn't have been widely known to a lot of Poles or to a lot of readers, But it was something that the editors decided to keep because it was reflective of his voice. He knew of these towns and villages, not by their Polish names. He knew them by his main language, which was Yiddish.
Of course, yeah.
And so this, I think, is an important part of, do you translate everything, or do you try to take a very thoughtful, reflective approach and say, what do we keep that maintains the voice and the integrity of the survivor author? And so I think that's something that's really important. Other memoirs, and as you've said, may have been written in another language. Hungarian, for example, we've had a few memoirs that were written in Hungarian, but that will keep that memoir sort of exclusive to a very small linguistic market and readership. So the Diary of Margaret Kasai, or As the Lilacs Bloomed by Hegedus, these were originally published in Hungarian, but both had lived in Canada, and so they wrote additional pieces at some point that gets compiled into the main narrative. And then translating from Hungarian into English will have its own challenges from time to time, whether that's choosing the correct word, for example, that might reflect a certain time period, 1930s, 1940s in Budapest. How do you choose a language that perhaps is not even used in Hungarian today, because the language evolves obviously over time, but you want to create a sense of the time period that the author is talking about. So you have to make certain linguistic decisions along the way. And I would say that at the foundation, these decisions are never taken lightly. These are often very thoughtful decisions that may involve conversations between the editor, between the translator, through a historian, through a literary scholar, so that in the end, you come up with something that everyone is happy with, and most importantly, keeps the voice of the survivor at the center of the narrative.
Translation always and inevitably involves interpretation. Words carry with them a chain of meanings and association in a given language, in a given national narrative tradition, and as soon as you translate it, you invite other kinds of associations, whether you want to or not. So the translated version is never identical with the original. But I have to say that for better and for worse, a work has to be in English to be noticed in the, let's call it, the wide world of Holocaust studies, and to reach the hands of most people who read books about the Holocaust. And so
and we're not just talking about a Canadian audience, we're talking about a worldwide audience.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. So for people who don't write in English, it's really important to not have their writing linger in obscurity. But I want to come back, Jonathan, to something you said when you were sort of framing this issue of translation, because you talked about translating not only language, but also translating cultures.
Cultural context, exactly.
Yes. And so, you can talk about the cultural context of Poland, Hungary, whatever country the person comes from, but there's also the cultural context of the Holocaust,
Mm-hmm.
where words acquire all sorts of meanings that cannot be easily captured, not only in translation, but in the original. We're really talking about how to translate experience. And so many, important writers have talked about their own frustration in trying to write about what they ran through. Charlotte Delbo says you use words like friendship and hunger and fear and thirst during the Holocaust when she was in Auschwitz. And she knows that her reader will read them and they'll think of their ordinary everyday experiences and they won't get that. Even Schindler's List, there's this moment where the Schindler in the movie says, do I have to invent a whole new language? And I remember sitting there in the theater thinking, yes, you do. Or you have to invent a narrative strategy.
Right.
And that's really what translation is about.
Yeah, and you have all these people coming together in the camps or the ghettos, being shuttled from one place to another, being assembled with other Jews, other people coming from Poland, people coming from Hungary, and being exposed to each other's language and maybe not even being able to communicate.
Or Greek, or people from Greek where there wasn't
Right.
Yiddish, it was Ladino.
Right.
I imagine, these experiences as really being a cacophony of languages, even if you're just looking at the Jewish people who are interned in labor camps or concentration camps, or even in some cases being shipped to ghettos en route to those kinds of camps. Primo Levi, who was an Italian Jew and was not a Yiddish speaker, in one of his books, he talks about hearing Yiddish spoken, which he did not understand, but he says, I can quote to you word for word conversations I overheard in Yiddish, even though I have no idea what they meant.
That's amazing. Sara, Carson, thanks for joining me today.
Truly a pleasure to talk to you, Jonathan.
And thank you. A pleasure speaking with both of you today.
The Forum, 20 Years of Publishing Survivor Narratives. Scholars reflect on the educational and cultural impact of the Azrieli Foundation's Survivor Memoirs Program, appears in the fall 2025 issue of Canadian Jewish Studies, Études, juives, canadiennes. I'm Jonathan Slater, and you've been listening to Tête-à-tête. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks to our fascinating guests, Sara Horowitz and Carson Phillips. We'd also like to congratulate the Azrieli Foundation's Holocaust Survivor Memoirs Program on its 20th anniversary and recognize the efforts of the many people involved in the program. This show is produced and edited by Theadora Draper in Toronto. Our music is provided by J.K. Bradley. Our executive producers are Joshua Tapper and David Koffman. Tête-à-tête is a podcast of the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. You can find out more about the ACJS and link to our journal and past podcast episodes by checking out our website, acjs-aejc.ca, with plans to be new and improved by early 2026. Stay tuned for additional information. We're grateful to our supporters, the Taubin family, the Israel and Golda Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council's Aid to Scholarly Journals program, and the J. Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry. In the show notes, you can find a transcript of my conversation with Sara Horowitz and Carson Phillips, and a link to our journal where you could read the forum about the Memoirs program and order a print copy of the fall 2025 issue. Plus, you'll find a link to learn more about the Memoirs program. We'd love it if you could share, like, and rate our podcast. You're also invited to add your email to the ACJS's occasional newsletter or support the ACJS's amazing work by following links in the show notes. If you have comments or thoughts about this podcast episode or any other of our episodes, feel free to email us at acjs@yorku.ca. Come back and join us for another conversation.